Hi there, it's Jeff here with a short 25-mark essay plan focused on Edexcel, and the topic this time is trade versus aid in the context of Ethiopia. Here's the stem. In 2023, Ethiopia received approximately $5 billion in official development assistance, just over 3% of their GDP, and that made it one of the largest aid recipients in Africa, with major donors including the United States and international organisations. Much of this aid was directed towards food, security, health and education. However, some economists argue that long-term development is better achieved through expanding trade, investment and private enterprise. And here's our question. Evaluate the view that trade is more effective than aid in promoting growth and development. Discuss with reference to Ethiopia or another developing country of your choice. Let's work through a suggested answer, and if you have any questions, please post them at the end in the comments section and I'll do my best to answer them. Here's my first analysis point. Trade can drive long-run growth, particularly if countries build their trade around emerging comparative advantage and then some specialisation. Trade through exports generates export revenues that brings in foreign exchange, US dollars for example, which in turn allows the funding of imports of capital goods, so things like machinery and key inputs that Ethiopia can't produce themselves. And in that sense, it supports industrialisation and the transfer of technologies. So trade can be an engine, a catalyst for structural transformation in countries such as Ethiopia, from a largely farm-based economy to manufacturing, which in turn raises labour productivity and real wages, especially if you get manufacturing at scale. And Ethiopia has become a centre for textile exports, has helped create urban employment. So the diagram opportunity there, I guess, would be a trade diagram showing the effects of specialisation, or an ADES diagram, exports as a driver of long-run growth, rising AD and aggregate supply. However, in evaluation, Ethiopia has a fairly narrow export base, high percentage of exports of goods linked to raw coffee, and that of course exposes them to commodity price volatility, which means their economy is likely to be less stable. Also the risk of the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, where the real value of these exports might fall over time. Poor infrastructure and being landlocked raise the trade cost. That's certainly a factor for Ethiopia, although the international airport in Addis Ababa has helped, particularly when it comes to low weight intermediate goods being shipped in and out. But poor infrastructure and being landlocked affects their competitiveness, and trade tends to benefit urban elites, but often leave extreme poverty in rural areas largely unchanged. So there can be, for example, the evaluation point here could be that trade could improve per capita incomes, but at the same time actually increase inequality between urban and rural areas. Second point is about aid. So the extent to which aid is justified. So, aid has a key role to play. It often fills development gaps. Targeted aid, particularly project aid, supports merit goods. You could bring in some externalities there, supporting baseline provision of education, maternal healthcare, better roads, improved sanitation, basic things, all of which improves human capital, reduces infant mortality, and in theory over time raises productivity. A bit of application there from my knowledge of Ethiopia, that aid-funded health campaigns have reduced under 5 infant mortality by a factor of more than 2 over the last 20 years. And aid during crisis, humanitarian assistance in the wake of drought and conflict, can prevent regression into much deeper poverty and lost years of HGI progress. What we find is that civil war or drought or pandemics can often cause the loss of, decades of HGI progress in the space of a few years. Aid perhaps can act as a palliative for that, providing some degree of stability, some limiting the downside risks. However, in evaluation, long-term aid dependence, we're told that aid wasn't at 3% of Ethiopian GDP, $5 billion a year, risks undermining growth and development. The risk of the Dutch disease, for example, if those multi-billion dollars of aid flows cause the exchange rate to appreciate, that could harm price-sensitive exports. And crucially, as many of you will write about, the impact, the effectiveness of aid varies widely from country to country. And it depends, of course, on the quality of governance, the extent and depth of corruption, and the ability of aid organisations to coordinate at the right time. If you put too much humanitarian aid in, it can actually damage domestic producers. With aid, there is always a big risk of government failure. Don't worry about using a micro term in a macro paper. Government failure has macro consequences. You'll then need a final reason comment. I would argue that trade can be a more sustainable, long-run engine of development than aid, especially when linked to value-added exports, if it improves infrastructure and inward FDI. But in fact, the more effective strategy might be to combine both. So targeted project aid, where you get your value for each dollar to build basic capacity, things like sanitation, off-grid energy systems, just access to good schools, and trade deepening via Ethiopia's membership of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to increase AD and per capita incomes. In other words, my final comment is sitting on the fence a bit. You really need success in both. You need trade deepening and you need targeted project aid. If you have any questions or any thoughts, please do post them in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them quickly. Take care. See you soon.